So, here we are once again with another look at my life in films. We're finally out of the 70s. We're now hitting the 80s, and by this point, I turned 7 this year, and so I was definitely more aware of the films that I was getting to see. Now, some of these films, obviously, I didn't see until I was later on in my teen years, but there's a lot of these that I saw on general release as soon as they came out. 1980, take it away. So, let's have a quick look over the box office for the US in 1980, and you can see Empire Strikes Back, top of the list. Of course it is. It blew the box office apart when it came out. People's anticipation for this film was through the roof. 9 to 5, Stir Crazy, Airplane, Any Which Way You Can, Private Benjamin, Coal Miner's Daughter, Smoking the Bandit 2, Blue Lagoon, and The Blues Brothers. Most of those films I've seen. In fact, I think there's only one that I've not seen. I'm going to cover a fair chunk of them through this. Quick roundup of news events from this year. So, Alfred Hitchcock sadly passed away at the age of 80 in April of this year. Richard Pryor set himself on fire while freebasing and drinking rum. And in the Oscars, ordinary people picked up film and director and screenplay and support, while Raging Bull gave De Niro a statue and fame came to town. So let's talk through some films that stood out for me particularly. So, films of note. So, one film that I watched when I was young, and I kind of enjoyed it when I was young, but as I got older and I revisited it, I realised it's absolutely a dreadful piece of garbage, and that's Clint Eastwood's Any Which Way You Can. I mean, this film was bad, but it still spawned a sequel because people latched onto it. It's his film about bare knuckle fighter. It's an action comedy, allegedly. It's only notable for the orangutan named Clyde, which resulted in pretty much all of us in the school playgrounds who'd seen this film constantly quoting the "right turn, Clyde," and then punching whoever to the right of us. Awful film. But I suppose as a kid, you just ignore the fact that something's terrible and you just latch onto something, and we latched onto the orangutan named Clyde. Jackie Chan's Big Brawl was released this year. Now, this was Chan's first attempt to break the US market. It was a commercial success, but it didn't quite make the money that Warner Brothers were hoping to make, and so it was considered a disappointment. They expected Enter the Dragon style numbers, even though Chan at that point in time wasn't enough of a name to sell it in the US. However, the advantage that this meant is that now we had an Americanized Jackie Chan film which was widely available, and it was because of this film and my entry into Jackie Chan films from this that I grew a love for Chan films and sought out pretty much everything that he's ever been in. Absolutely, I can't talk about Chan's films enough with enough passion to really express how much I adore them, except for the past couple of decades. Let's ignore them. And this was the film that was my entry point. And so, even though it's not a great film, it's got some moments, it's nowhere near the upper part of his echelon of films, but it's got enough in there to grab my attention as a young kid. His fast and frantic acrobatic martial arts style, marvellous. Blue Lagoon came out this year. Now, I'm not saying for 1 second that this is a good film. In fact, I couldn't really tell you much about the film, except it's a story of some kids that are abandoned on a desert island and grow up together and fall in love. No, I don't know what the plot is, because Brooke Shields was in this with hardly any clothes on. And as a young teen, when I first saw this film, you know what? Who needs story? I've never had the compulsion to revisit this film. It always, whenever I've seen clips of it, I've always thought, oh dear, that's terrible. And I know that there was a spin-off sequel around about the 90s, Return to the Blue Lagoon. Didn't bother watching that either. This wasn't the first time that this story had been adapted, because it was a novel from 1908, and it had already had 2 adaptations, but I think this is the one that's most notorious because of, well, Brooke Shields with no clothes on. On a complete opposite side, you've got David Lynch delivering one of his career highlights, The Elephant Man, with Anthony Hopkins and John Hurt starring. John Hurt is playing in the dramatisation of the life story of John Merrick, the Victorian, highly intelligent, well-spoken, educated man who was ridiculed and shunned by society because of his physical deformity. This film is touching, it's engaging, it's absolutely marvellous, and I revisited this last year, and it's Lynch's it's one of his best movies. Let's be honest, it's right up there at the top. And another film that's well worth going back to, Fame. Now, Fame gets disregarded by people who don't really know of the film. They only know of the reputation of the film because it spawned a TV series, and it seems like a bunch of spoilt, like, Academy people, and it's overly dramatised, and it's all singing and all dancing. No. If you've never watched Fame, go and watch it, because it's quite a gritty drama of teens wanting to be something, joining the academy, and learning how to perform whilst their lives are going on around them. So there's all the troubles, the hardships, drugs, sex, violence, whatever. But it's Alan Parker giving you a film that not only tells a good solid story, but it also sparked the 80s trend of films with musical elements that played the musical elements like music videos. It launched Irene Cara's career, span off the popular TV show, and it's a film that is definitely, it stands up quite well. Revisiting it in these years, even though it's set in the 80s, it doesn't feel completely embedded in the 80s, if you get what I'm saying. And one film of note from this year is Scorsese's Raging Bull, but I'm not going to talk about it being an influence on me, because I only watched it for the first time this year. Yes, this was probably the only Scorsese film that I had never, ever gotten round to. And I've been mocked and ridiculed lots of times about it, so feel free to continue mocking and ridiculing down in the comments below. So, we've already spoken about Fame, so let's flip back to musicals, because there was a few here that impacted on me as a kid. First of all, we've got The Great Rock and Roll Swindle. It's a mockumentary from Julian Temple that tells a semi-fictitious aspect of the origins of the Sex Pistols, how they were created and formed to how they were dissolved, and plays it on the idea that Malcolm McLaren crafted them deliberately and he brought them together. This is all false, it was all fake, and he used them to manipulate it just to get a cash grab and get money, cause controversy, get the money from that record studio, cause more controversy, get a payout from here, and it has fun with it. Now, it's a chaotic and some would say anarchic kind of film, and if you're not a fan of the Pistols, there's pretty much no reason to even bother with this one. However, if you are a fan of the Pistols, you're clearly here watching this for the music, and there's some great variations on like well-known Pistols tracks, some good footage of the band from when they were together, and also some really iconic additional songs put in there for fun. There's some jokes, there's some laughs, there's some daft comedies in there, but it's more just a general feel of the punk era told in a mockumentary kind of way. It's not the best mockumentary about the music industry that there's been plenty more, and we'll get to one of them in a few years, but it's well worth checking out, if only to find out what the hell Ed Tudor Pole singing Who Killed Bambi is all about. We've also got Can't Stop the Music. Now, I'm not trying to say for 1 second that this is a good film. This is not as fun as The Great Rock and Roll Swindle. It's a village people origin story, and heaven knows why at the age of 7 I was taken to the cinema to see this. Yes, I saw this at the cinema. The UK rating system was an absolute mess back then. Why was I subjected to this trash? But as a kid, I don't have much memory of the film itself, but I latched onto the music. It claims to be a musical comedy. Comedy. It barely scrapes even half of that description, but as a kid, I did latch onto the music, and because of being subjected to this at the age of 7 at the cinema, I've constantly got YMCA and Can't Stop the Music rattling around in my head permanently ever since. That's 40 years of that trash stuck in my head. Thanks, Mum. Okay, that out of the way, let's move on to a great musical, The Blues Brothers. If you've never seen The Blues Brothers, what are you doing with your life? Jake and Elwood Blues, played brilliantly by Dan Aykroyd and John Belushi, had risen to fame through small little musical numbers on Saturday Night Live, and so a movie was made about them trying to put the band back together after Belushi's Jake gets released from prison. It's fabulously fun. The music is memorable, iconic, legendary. There's some legends of the blues and soul genre within there, delivering some masterpiece set pieces. It's got one of the best car chases of all time, some of the most quotable lines of any film ever, and it's a film that you can keep going back to and repeatedly enjoy. Just never, never, never watch the sequel. Speaking of sequels, moving into sci-fi and fantasy, because you know how much that's close to my heart, like the devil that I am. Empire Strikes Back. We've already mentioned it before. It was the top film of the year. Now, what can be said about The Empire Strikes Back that hasn't been said thousands of times? Not much. So maybe I should just move on. No, let me just say, Irving Kershner took over the role of director on this one, delivering a darker entry into the series, one that progressed the characters more than the story. It's a perfect sequel. A sequel so perfect that, according to reports, Lucas wasn't that happy with it, and he insisted that when it came to Return of the Jedi, he was on set with the director who was assigned for that film pretty much all the time, so he could mould it and control it. Kershner gave us some iconic moments: the AT-AT attack, the asteroid field, the first confrontation between Luke and Vader. Ooh, and that reveal is played out masterfully. And if you don't know what the reveal is, seriously, you don't know. Although the prequels have now kind of ruined that, because it ruins that surprise element. And this is the thing that I have about the prequels that I'll get to when we get round to the prequels, is that they retroactively destroy the impact of the original trilogy. Anyway, Empire Strikes Back, marvellous film, great sequel, the best in the series. Another sequel, one that has a lot of love, but I don't quite have as much love as other people. Superman 2. This is going to be controversial, but I actually think that it's a weaker film than the first. Donner's original plans, he filmed 1 and 2 back to back. He wanted to split it down the middle, release them as 2 separate films, but he had that rug pulled away from him, and whilst he was left to tidy up his first film, the second film was passed over to Richard Lester, who'd given us like films that I absolutely adore from the early part of the 70s, the Musketeers films, for example. He finished them off, and what we have as a result is a film that, as a kid, I adored. You know, we had Kryptonian baddie in the form of Zod, which meant that we had Terence Stamp with some iconic lines. We had some proper action between Superman and someone who could take his punches and deliver them back. We also had a nice subplot about Lois discovering who Clark is, and him then giving up everything just so he could be with her. Some great moments and great elements, but it was Lesterified. It was given some slapstick comedy. It was added laughable moments to try to deliver a film, and the film doesn't age as well as that first film does, because it feels disjointed. It feels like the product of 2 separate visions. I'm not saying it's in any way as bad as the more recent product of 2 separate visions from DC, Justice League, looking straight at you. But loads of people say this is their favourite Superman film out of the Christopher Reeve era. idiots say that Man of Steel is their favourite Superman film. Pooh. That's me getting flamed by a load of Snyder fans. It's not, in my opinion, as strong and as timeless as Donner's original. And it is because of the disjointedness of two separate visions within there. Still a strong film. I'm not saying it's bad. It's still up there. It's maybe a 7 or 8 out of 10. And largely that is held together through the performances, which are excellent as always, and the basic story. It is just that creative style that lets it down. Now, one film that has a creative style that doesn't let it down, because it knows exactly what it is and it plays to it, is Flash Gordon. We spoke about this on the podcast way back in, I think, April or May. It was one of our revisits. And the adaptation of Alex Raymond's comic book hero to the big screen by Mike Hodges had Sanjay Jones in the iconic lead role, Melody Anderson as Dale Arden, Topol as Zarkov, and Max von Sydow as Ming. It's gloriously over the top, it's beautifully colourful, it's an absolute pleasure of a film. There's a plethora of British thespians scattered throughout, and none are more memorable than Brian Blessed as Voltan, with his iconic line that surely everyone knows. This is a film that I'll happily revisit over and over again and still absolutely enjoy. And yes, it looks corny and cheesy, but that's kind of the charm. And thus, it lives up to today's standards quite well. We never got a sequel. I would have loved to have seen another adventure with this crew. But sadly, it's just a one-off. But what a one-off. Marvellous film. As for one-offs, on one of the last ones we spoke about Ralph Bakshi's Lord of the Rings, telling half the story of the Lord of the Rings. Well, because we never got the sequel to Bakshi's Lord of the Rings, instead Rankin Bass, who delivered us that Hobbit film that I don't particularly like, jumped on the chance to churn out a film to finish the tale off. And as a kid, I despised this film. I absolutely found it abhorrent. I watched Bakshi's version. I had already read by the time I watched Bakshi's version. I didn't watch Bakshi's version, just to make it clear, until the early 80s when it came out on VHS. I had read the whole of The Lord of the Rings by the time I'd turned 10. And so when I discovered that there was a Return of the King, which was middle of the 80s, I didn't watch this on the year it came out. I jumped on it, rented it, sat and watched it, hated every second of it. It's twee, it doesn't fit the darker elements of the story, it's a mess. Rankin Bass sucks ass. Simple as that. Don't bother watching it. Stick with Bakshi's one and then just go, oh, we'll never find out the end, and then move to Peter Jackson's live action adaptations, which we'll get to in a good few episodes. Horror. Now, the 70s gave us a load of horror, and the 80s looks set to continue that as franchises and adaptations became the norm. Now, let's start with an adaptation. Stephen King's The Shining, adapted by Stanley Kubrick. And Kubrick took that unique approach of adapting a King book by ignoring most of the novel and making the film his own. And for that, it's one of the worst adaptations of King ever, whilst also being one of the best horror films of all time. If you can distance it from the fact that it doesn't represent Stephen King's book, it's a marvellous, marvellous film. If you want a perfect adaptation of Stephen King's book, then you're probably going to be disappointed. But no, this is genuinely one of the best horror films of all time. Nicholson is captivating throughout it. Shelley Duvall's genuine horror, largely because Kubrick treated her like absolute garbage on set and terrorised her himself. It makes it all so much more real, and it's a timeless film. It still stands up today. The whole isolation, the whole haunting aspect, brilliant film that I can gladly go back to and revisit and reanalyse, because as few documentaries and insights have proven, there's many ways that you can interpret this film, just like every Kubrick film, to be honest. John Carpenter decided to churn out The Fog, and this supernatural horror hasn't stood the test of time very well. It's very dated and it's not that scary. But when I saw this round about the age of 10, when I was really getting into my horrors and they were getting rented out on VHS for me. It worked for me as a young entry to horror. As a youngster, you overlook some of the weaker elements of some films, some of the poor acting, some of the hamminess, some of the poor effects. You can see past them and just be terrified. And I was terrified of the fog. No, genuinely, fog outside the house would start to unnerve me because of this film. Not a great film to revisit, but one that definitely impacted on my love of horror at an early age and definitely cemented the name John Carpenter in my mind. Friday the 13th was another film that came out this year, and this was following the success of Halloween. Halloween, 2 years earlier, had introduced masked slashers killing loads of late teens. So it was no shock that the formula was adapted by other films, and this is possibly the most successful of the formula stealers. The setting is an abandoned summer camp that is being slowly put back together and getting ready to reopen again, but the camp counsellors keep getting killed one by one by someone or something that is mysteriously stalking them. Now, this first film has a great reveal that is then largely ignored from the second film onwards, but it's a great film. This is a great example of the slasher genre. The franchise might have become a bit comically ridiculous as it progressed, but much like the Halloween films, this first film in the series is definitely one worth checking out. A film that's woefully misunderstood. I remember watching this as a kid and being chilled and terrified by it. And as I've watched it as an adult, I see the underlying satire that is actually within there, and that's Alligator. Now, this is a film that started millions of urban myths about crocodiles and alligators in New York sewers, because the story is a girl's father flushes her baby alligator down the toilet, and a few years later it's grown to immense size because it's been feasting on the discarded corpses of animals that are being experimented on with a growth hormone. Absolute nonsense. But the intentional satire help it stand up because of this approach. As a kid, I was just latching on to the fact this is a monster movie. This is a giant alligator rising up from the sewers and snapping people. And it was a great thrill. But as you get older, you start to see the corporate satires, the societal satire that's in there. Stands well. The sequel, not so much, but this one stands up well. Definitely impacted on me as a kid. Comedies. So let's talk about a few comedies. Now, first of all, we've got the action comedy of Smoking the Bandit 2. I've already spoken about my love of Smoking the Bandit, and Smoking the Bandit 2 repeated that love beautifully. It was just put the gang back together, give them another road adventure, there you go. More CB usage, more being chased by a nutty sheriff, and more Burt Reynolds being his charming self on screen. Stir Crazy, directed by Sidney Poitier, starred Richard Pryor and Gene Wilder as two guys who find themselves set up as having performed a bank robbery and get put down for 125 years. 125 years? That's a hell of a sentence for just a bank robbery. Anyway, they then spend the time in prison trying to work out how they can either prove their innocence or escape. And the story involves Pryor's character becoming quite skilled at rodeo and getting entered into the rodeo tournament. It's fun. It plays on the zany strengths of the pair who'd already paired up before a few years ago in Silver Streak, and it's probably the last time that Richard Pryor was really, really top of his game, probably because of what I mentioned earlier in the news. Herbie Goes Bananas came out this year, and the love bug was clearly running out of gas by the time of this film. It pretty much plays the formula to death, and even at a young age, after I watched this at the cinema, I had no interest in watching it again. Whenever it popped up on TV, whenever any Herbie films popped up on TV when I was growing up, I would be like, looking through the Radio Times, spotting a Herbie film is on over Christmas, and watching that, circling it to make sure that I get to watch it. With this one, if that was listed there, it'd be like, what's on the other side? Why Don't You? Yeah, I'm going to watch Why Don't You. And for those who don't know what Why Don't You is, search it. Not worth watching. Didn't really have much of an impact, except for it made me not want any more Herbie films to get made. One film that sadly we never got to see a sequel for, and it's sadly overlooked by far too many people, is Robert Altman's Popeye. Taking the cartoon character, making it live action, Robin Williams as the lead role of Popeye, Shelley Duvall as a magnificent Olive. This is a film that I adored when I saw it in the cinema as a kid, and throughout my years, every 5 to 10 years, I've gone back and rediscovered it to see whether it still lives up, and each time I fell in love with it again. I've always been baffled as to how it was considered a disappointment by the studio, because apparently it actually more than made profit. And it's woefully overlooked by so many people. There's loads of people who, when you do a, like, what's your favourite Robin Williams films, everyone goes for all the usuals. Everyone goes for, oh, Good Morning Vietnam, oh, yeah. I will throw out Popeye as one of them, and get blank looks from people who have never heard of it. It's woefully underseen. It needs to be appreciated by a lot more people. And the songs that are mixed in are fun, with great musical pieces, and they have extra meaning as you get older. When I was young, I just loved the songs for them being songs. But as you get older, I mean, particularly when you get to Olive Oyl singing about he's large, there's an underlying subtext going on there. Williams is a perfect Popeye. The live-action cartoon element is brilliantly realised. Definitely one to revisit. And one that I revisited recently that stood up as much better than what I expected is Private Benjamin. Goldie Hawn starred in the film about a Jewish woman who, after her husband dies on their wedding night, signs up to the army. Is completely taken aback by how strict and controlled the army is, because she was expecting it to be a bit of a holiday, like the adverts always say. And it's a formula that would get repeated later in the decade with other films and franchises. Most notably, the Police Academy series would take a similar approach. But it's Goldie Hawn in this film that really sells it. She's got an absolute draw and charm, and it helped sell a spin-off TV series that was very short-lived. I loved this as a kid. I used to love the TV series as well. Revisited it recently, worried that it wouldn't stand up. But you know what? I was completely captivated right from the offset. Great film. If you've never seen it, check it out. Goldie Hawn, absolutely perfection in it. A film that I kind of enjoyed, but I don't have a desire to go back to, is Caddyshack. Now, this impacted on me when I was in my mid to late teens. It caught my attention round about then. Harold Ramis directed Chevy Chase, Rodney Dangerfield and Bill Murray, amongst others, in a film about the antics of people at a golf club, including Murray's groundskeeper, who's determined to get rid of a gopher that's plaguing the course. The film is crude and juvenile, so obviously during my teens, that's what latched onto me. And I know a load of people say it's one of their favourite films of all time, but I have no desire to go back to it because I don't recall it being that great. I just recall it being crude and juvenile and just playing to that part of my psyche as I was growing up. Maybe it's a film that is best left in the past, and maybe I shouldn't go back to it because I don't want to ruin the fact that I enjoyed it back then by watching it and going, oh. One film that I will go back to though, and throughout the 70s ones, pretty much every video that I did, I spoke about disaster movies, because there was always disaster movies, especially the airport films. They came out thick and fast. Well, this year gave us the disaster movie to end all disaster movies. And I mean that. It ended the disaster movie fad, particularly the airport ones. Yes, Airplane came out. Airplane, again, another film that we spoke of as a revisit on the podcast a couple of months ago. We spoke of our love of it. It introduced the world to the comic timings and styles of Leslie Nielsen. Zucker Abrams, at their finest parodying, they took the formula of the airport disaster films and really went to town with them. Not in a harsh way, but in a lovingly mocking way. It played every element that you've seen in those disaster movies to the extreme, but played it seriously, straight-faced. No one was No one was like, ha ha ha, nods and winks to the camera. There was occasional fourth wall break-ins, looks to the camera, but everything was played to seriousness, despite how farcical it all was. Absolutely, absolutely one of the best comedies of all time. This is a film that I can pop on today, and I will be chuckling and laughing out loud throughout it, because the comedy just hits the perfect beat. And I think, on that note of a perfect film, I think we'll draw a line under the films that influence me. Now, I know there are a few films out this year that I've not seen before you start saying, but you've missed this, you've missed that. Feel free to tell me that I need to watch The Jazz Singer. Feel free to tell me that I need to watch The Long Good Friday. Feel free to tell me that I need to see Ordinary People. Feel free to tell me that I need to see many other films, because I'm sure there's a load that you can drop in the comments down below and say, this influenced you in 1980. But those films that I've been speaking about were the ones that had some kind of impact on me from the early stages of my life. 1980. Thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe. You know the trick. See you later.